Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today I'll be doing a video on the topic of basic planning in chess. Specifically, how to get good pieces from the opening. Obviously a very important topic. Once you learn how to put your pieces in their most effective squares, this is kind of the first step to developing into a strong opening and middle game player. So I'll be showing you guys a couple of examples today from classic master games and just highlighting a couple of common ideas to think about when you're deciding where to put your pieces in the opening. So our first game starts with e4, and black played e5, knight f3. Of course, this move is very common. I'm sure many of you have seen it before, and this is the most natural square for white's king knight in the opening. On f3, not only does it control the center, it also attacks the pawn on e5, and it develops the knight to overall very, very good square. It's pretty indisputable that knights are almost always better placed in the center of the board. Now, in some occasional openings, you will see knights being developed to the side of the board, for example a3 or a6 for black, but keep in mind that this kind of development is always with the intention of then rerouting the knight towards the center, either c4 or c2. In this case, that would be c5 or c7 for black. It's pretty much indisputable, I have to say. Knights are always going to be better placed in the center from where they control more squares. Knights are short-range pieces. Here black plays knight c6, and white plays bishop b5. This is known as the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish game. Of course, white has other options here. Bishop c4 is also very, very popular, known as the Italian game, just to develop the bishop to this diagonal, where it's putting pressure on f7. Bishops are not too hard to understand either in terms of development. You want to put them on active squares where they have actual targets. It's a common beginner's mistake to play a move like bishop d3, as this puts the bishop in a very passive position, blocking itself with the e4 pawn and also blocking the d pawn from advancing, which then blocks white's other bishop. So bishop e5 is very natural and very good. Here black plays a6, putting the question to the bishop. And here black is asking whether white is going to capture on c6 or retreat the bishop to a4. In this case, white plays a4, bishop a4, which is the main line. White does have a choice to take on c6, and I should briefly mention that white does not win a pawn here with knight takes e5. Black can win the pawn back with a common trick, queen d4, with a double attack on the e4 pawn and the knight, and black is perfectly fine in this case. So bishop a4 is considered a bit more popular. Black develops the knight to the center, castles, bishop e7, and now rook to e1. So rooks are a bit of a challenge, I think, for developing players, because we all know that rooks are well placed on open files, but in many openings we don't get any open files, and so it's not clear where the rooks should be placed. So in this kind of situation, I'll offer you guys just one, maybe two pieces of advice. Number one, if you don't know where to put your rooks, I would say focus on your other pieces first and keep your rook flexible so that you can put it on a good square in the future. Number two, if it's time to develop the rook, then you need to put it on a file that has a good chance of opening up in the future. And to determine that, you're going to have to use your own judgment and experience of the position. Here, the move rook e1 is very standard, and it makes a lot of sense to put the rook on e1 here. Number one, white defends the pawn on e4, which means that now white is threatening to capture the knight on c6 and win the e5 pawn. And number two, the rook has increased the scope of itself on the e-file. A lot of times, a common idea for black in this opening is to play the pawn break, pawn to d5, in which case white can capture on d5, and the rook has opened up on the e-file where it will be placed very actively. So although the rook on e1 doesn't look like a super active piece, white is putting his rook here kind of as a long-term guide. Put the rook where you think the file might open up in the future. Okay, black plays b5. This is black dealing with the threat of white threatening to take the knight and win the e5 pawn. Bishop b3 was played. Of course, the bishop finds a very nice spot on b3 where it's targeting the f7 pawn. In general, as you guys know, bishops do prefer long diagonals. And as long as your pieces are controlling a lot of squares, usually they're going to be placed on good squares in the position. Black plays d6, supporting the center and opening up the bishop from c8. Now it looks like black has blocked in his own bishop on e7, and while this bishop is passive, it's important to note that the bishop is still centralized and is supporting the king side. So the bishop looks passive, it has no squares to go to, but it's still serving a very important function in the game. Another quick thing I want to mention about bishops is that bishops are long-range pieces, and a lot of times the bishop might not look so active, but once a couple pawns get traded, the position opens up, the bishops come out and become stronger. So bishops, sometimes like rooks, you have to kind of use their potential and put them on squares where in the future, if the position ever opens up, the bishop might be useful. Here white plays c3. Now this is a common idea in the Ruy Lopez. The point is to try and push d2, d4 and gain more control over the center. Of course, in addition to your pieces, you also have to figure out what you're going to do with your pawns in the opening. Typically speaking, controlling the center is very useful, and the only time you want to push pawns on the side of the board is when they serve a specific function. Here black kind of had to play a6 and b5 in order to kick white's bishop away from its active square, and we'll see that this was a useful pawn move for black. We're not going to see the players here making unnecessary pawn moves. Now black plays kind of an interesting move, knight to a5. At first glance, this move seems a little bit strange because black took a centralized knight and put it on the side of the board, but this move has actually two ideas. Number one, black is starting to take the bishop on b3. This is one of white's best minor pieces, so this would be an excellent exchange for black. And after white retreats the bishop to c2, here comes black's second idea, pawn to c5. So with this move, black is increasing his control over the center square d4, and at the right moment, he's going to bring the knight back into the center with c6. So this knight a5 move, this is like a temporary way of putting the knight on the side in order to achieve some strategic goals. Here, white plays d4. Makes a lot of sense to fight for the center. And queen c7. Black is putting the queen to support the e5 and c5 pawns. And now white plays h3. This move is very useful for white in order to prevent black's bishop from coming to g4, which would include this kind of uncomfortable pin on the knight on f3. Generally speaking, again, you don't want to make a pawn move unless it serves some specific purpose. Here we can call this a prophylactic move, preventing black from activating the bishop on g4. Black plays knight c6, and white plays bishop e3, developing the bishop to a good square. And finally, black castles, gets his king safe. Castling is one of the most important points of the opening. You need to get your king safe because once the position opens up, you want your king tucked away, defended by your pawns so that it doesn't cross in the line of fire of enemy pieces. And now white plays knight bd2, developing his last piece. Keep in mind that white's center here is well protected by the pawn, the bishop, and the knight. So it's time to develop the last piece. And the knight on d2, it doesn't make such a huge impression right now. It's quite passive, it's not as active as the knight on f3, but we'll see that this knight is in fact going to go to f1. Again, looks passive since it's on the back rank, and then the knight will have access to either g3 or e3, where the knight will be more active. As a side note, this is one of the main ideas of actually moving the rook from f1 to e1. It opens up this f1 square for white's knight to come here. Now black plays bishop d7, he's connecting the rooks and developing the bishop to the center, and rook to c1 is played. So this move looks very, very strange. Of course, the c-file is not open by any means, and the rook seems to be doing absolutely nothing, but actually this move has a very significant purpose in terms of strategy. Like I mentioned earlier, when there are no open files, it might not be obvious where you should place your rooks. You should look for files that can be potentially open in the near future. In this case, that's the c-file. At any moment, black might capture c5 takes d4, in which case after white recaptures, the c-file will be opened up, and in fact this rook long term is kind of eyeing black's queen on c7. As a general rule of thumb, I tell my students, if you don't know where to put the rook, you should either put it on a file that you think is going to open up, or just line it up against the opponent's queen. You never know when the file will open up and some kind of tactics will arise for yourself. If the c-file ever opens up, then all white needs to do is move the bishop and you'll have this direct attack against black's queen. So potentially this is useful. Now black played knight to e8, and here the middle game is starting. Of course, this move knight e8 looks very strange, but black's idea is to remove the knight from blocking the f-pawn so that long term, at some point, black can play f5 and fight for some activity. Note that black rook on f8 currently seems very passive, but once black plays f5, his rook will be included into the game. Now white played knight to f1. The knight is going to be transferred to either e3 or g3. Black plays g6, supporting the f5 break, and potentially putting the knight on g7, where it will also support pushing the pawn to f5. And here white plays the move bishop h6, simply using the fact that this square is now available to put his bishop on a more active position attacking black's rook. Knight g7 was played, and knight to e3. So white finally reroutes this knight to a strong square on e3, where it has access to the d5 square, which is a very nice outpost for the knight. It cannot be attacked by any of black's pawns. So we'll end here. If you guys are curious about how this game proceeded, white ended up winning this game, I encourage you to take a look at the PGN, but at this point the opening is long gone, and as we can see, both sides have developed their pieces to very reasonable squares. Just a quick bit of advice to wrap up. You're always looking for the most effective square for your piece where it is either controlling the center or attacking a specific target in your opponent's position. Don't be afraid to maneuver your pieces once the middle game starts in order to put them on better squares. Here, in this position, a lot of players might not want to play this move bishop h6 because they think, well, I've already moved the bishop once, why am I moving it again? Well, now that the middle game has started, you have the freedom to start maneuvering your pieces to stronger squares. Not only does white put the bishop on a more active square, he also opens up the e3 square for his knight and activates this piece as well. So now let's look at another example featuring a different mode of development. This next game starts with the queen pawn. White plays d4. So I wanted to include an example here with one game where white starts e4, one game white starts d4, kind of to show you guys a variety of openings and how you should approach developing your pieces. Black played d5 and c2, c4 is played. This opening is known as the queen's gambit, and the point is, if black captures the pawn on c4, white can try to play e2, e4, get a big center, and win back the pawn on c4 with a nice central majority with the pawns on d4 and e4. So this isn't really a true gambit. It's actually very difficult for black to defend the c4 pawn once he takes. I would say it's kind of like a temporary gambit. White gives up a pawn temporarily, wins back the pawn in a few moves, and will have a nice center to show for it. So in this game, black played e6. This opening is known as the queen's gambit declined, meaning black is declining to accept the pawn. Knight c3 is played, and knight to f6. So real quick point I wanted to make about the c4 move. It might be curious as to why white needs to play c4 here, and the point is that after black plays e6, white plays knight c3, and he's developing the knight behind the pawn. This is kind of a subtle point, but it's very, very important. If white was to develop knight c3 here, the knight is actually going to be not a very active piece, even though it is centralized. Once black plays c6 or e6, the knight doesn't put any kind of pressure on d5 because this is simply defended very nicely by a pawn. The reason we start with c4 is that white can then put more pressure on black's center. Once again, the opening is all about trying to fight for the center. Here with the knight and pawn both attacking d5, white is putting more pressure on the center and thus has a more active position. Okay, black plays knight f6, developing the knight to the center, and bishop g5. Definitely the most active move in the position, putting the bishop on g5 and creating a pin on the knight on f6. This is kind of a mirror image if you imagine the Ruy Lopez that we just saw in the previous example, where white played knight to f3 and bishop to b5, putting pressure on the knight to c6. Here white plays knight c3 and bishop g5, kind of a reverse image of the opening. This goes to show that a lot of openings, they have a very, let's say, harmonious way of developing the pieces. Black plays bishop e7, breaking the pin, getting ready to castle, and e3. Once again, note that white first developed the bishop and then pushed the pawn to e3. This is a lot stronger than playing e3 first, as of course now, if we did this, our bishop would be blocked in on c1 and would end up being a very passive piece. So always think about developing your bishops. We call this outside the pawn chain. Here white has a small pawn chain, f2, e3, d4, and by developing the bishop outside the chain, the bishop can now be an active participant in the game. Black castled, knight f3. Now black has one problem to solve. Of course, this knight can be developed either to c6 or more commonly to d7, but the bishop on c8 doesn't have a clear purpose because it's blocked by the pawn on e6. Well, black solves this problem with the very natural move b7, b6. Now the bishop is going to be developed on b7, the long diagonal, and at the right moment, black might take the pawn on c4 in order to open up the bishop where it'll stand very actively. White played bishop d3, and here black played bishop b7. I think another option that should be considered quite seriously is to take on c4, and after white recaptures, to play bishop b7. And now the bishop stands very nicely on b7, it is controlling the long diagonal, and black can continue with knight bd7, and then pushing the pawn to c5 in order to challenge white's space advantage in the center. This is a very harmonious setup for black. I think it makes less sense to put the knight on c6, because like we saw earlier with white playing c4 and putting the knight on c3, here the knight on c6 doesn't really put so much pressure on the d4 pawn because this pawn is supported by white's other pawn. Instead, by playing knight bd7, black is supporting the break c7, c5, and he can put pressure on white's center and all of his pieces are developed in the center of the board. In the game, black played bishop to b7, and now white captured the pawn on d5. And white's point is that after e takes d5, the bishop on b7 is now blocked by the pawn, and black doesn't have this option to take on c4. It was possible for black to play knight takes d5 as well. In this case, I think white would most likely exchange the bishops on e7, and black would have a choice here. Either he can take with the queen, or he can take with the knight. The reason why black might not want to go for this is because here, he doesn't have his pawn on d5, he only has his knight, so white can assume full control over the center with a move like e4 in the future. For example, castles, next move white can play e4 and have a nice big pawn center, and if black ever takes on c3, white will happily take with the b pawn in order to strengthen his center even more. But I think this was a very playable option for black as it keeps the bishop very active on b7. But black's choice to take e takes d5 is also understandable as he keeps a nice grip over the d5 square and controls the e4 square. Here white plays the move knight to e5. This is a really nice move to centralize the knight. And white's idea is that after black plays knight b to d7, he plays the move f2, f4, fully supporting the knight. This game was played by a great player of the 19th century, Harry Nelson Pillsbury. And in fact, this setup with the knight on e5 supported by the pawn on f4 and the pawn on d4, this is now known as the Pillsbury attack, named after some of his games. White gets a very strong knight on e5 supported by his two pawns, and his idea is that if black ever exchanges the knight on e5, white is going to take with the f pawn, attacking the knight on f6, and opening up the f-file, which he can use for his attack. So white is going to castle kingside, and his rook will be very actively placed on the f-file. This is a really nice strategic concept that we now see in many different openings. Note that white had to play knight e5 in this position. If he castled here, then black would play knight bd7, and white is not in time to play knight e5, because black can capture and white has to take with the d pawn, which isn't as favorable. He would much rather take with the f pawn and open the f file. So the game continued knight e5, knight bd7, f4. Black played c5, very natural move to fight for the center, and here white castled. Now if you'd like to see the rest of this game, it's quite a classic game. I would encourage you to look at the PGN. White ended up putting his queen on f3, which is very active, and then this queen can be transferred to either h3 or g3, where the queen can be used against the king in a very straightforward kingside attack. I really liked how white played this game, so I'd encourage you guys to take a look at the PGN and learn for yourself, but for the purposes of this lesson, I think the game is more or less pretty clear. I wanted to include this example to show you guys kind of the standard mode of development when you're playing the queen pawn opening, aka pushing the pawn to d4 on the first move. With that, we'll wrap up our lesson here. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, found this instructive as to what are the kind of patterns and the key ways you can look to activate your pieces and put them on good squares right from the opening in the game. Until next time, this was International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, signing off.